We could get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I would say this afternoon, but for some of you, it might be evening. In any case, thanks for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jakobina Arch from our history department. She earned her bachelor's in biological sciences and medieval Renaissance studies at Wellesley College, a master's in biology at the Dalhousie University, another master's in regional studies East Asia at Harvard University, then went on to earn her PhD in history and East Asian languages there as well. Dr. Arch's research includes marine environmental history, early modern and modern Japanese history, and the history of science, animal history, and particularly whales. She joined the faculty at Whitman in 2014, so over 10 years ago. Teaching classes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to point that out. Yeah, but we're happy that you've been here as long as you have. She teaches classes such as East Asian environmental history, Pacific whaling history, and Japan's modern empire. She is joining us from sabbatical this semester, and she's currently on hiatus, but will return to a term as chair of the history department. Bina, I am happy to turn the program over to you.
Great, thank you. So I am really pleased to be able to share some of the research that I am currently working on. I'm going to back up a little bit and give you a bit of context as to how I got into this. My first book, Bringing Whales Ashore, came out in 2018, and that was a marine environmental history of Tokugawa Japan, which is a period that covers the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate from 1603 to 1868. And I'm now in the process of working on a second book of marine environmental history in that same period, but thinking about it from a different lens, this time making use of Japanese castaway accounts and shipwrecks, and working around this central example of cargo ship construction and use. And that's in part because in the first book project, I started off thinking about the history of whaling in Japan, but the more I worked on it, the more I ended up thinking about how interactions with whales could show us the importance of the marine environment as a whole. And that project focused on extractive industry. So it's like, what are people taking out of the ocean? And I wanted to think about, well, how are people actually more directly interacting with the ocean? And I thought boats was a good way to do that, think about what do people make to get themselves able to exist out in that space and move across it and so forth. So today, I'm going to be introducing some material that I just had published as a chapter in an edited volume that came out last year. And this was, in part, working out the material that I hope eventually to put together in a book, but it's very sketchy right now. And so this is polished in some ways and still a work in progress in others. So from the late 17th through the late 19th centuries, there was a booming coastal trade carried on a new type of ship called a bezaisen. They were filling the nearshore waters of the Japanese archipelago. And in 1813, the 22 sailors of the Eiji Maru went adrift in the open ocean after 2 weeks of steady northwest winds pushed them away from the coast of Ki Domain, which is today's Wakayama Prefecture. And reflecting on this experience, the 3 survivors reported that, this is a quote translated from them, we had lost sight of the mountains. Now, whose domain's waters were we in? All of us felt helpless. So all 3 sailors had made a living aboard such ships since childhood, but were literally out of their depth when faced with open Pacific rather than familiar waters kind of near the Japanese archipelago, as marked by the visibility of its mountainous shorelines from the ships. When they couldn't see the mountains anymore, they knew they weren't in Japan anymore. And reliance on wind power produced ship technologies in this period adapted to very particular environmental conditions. and a similar reliance on sailors' personal knowledge of those conditions. So by looking at these sailors and especially the disasters that they ran into, I hope to be able to kind of rethink what this space was like for those people who were not literate usually, and therefore we have to kind of triangulate around what we can find out about them. So Besaicen were a type of large wooden sailing vessel. You can see them on the left-hand side of this woodblock print coming into Edo, which is the shogunal capital. It's now Tokyo. Uh, this ship was developed specifically for this immense new volume of Tokugawa period domestic trade, so just in and around the Japanese islands. Um, Besaicen are therefore emblematic of how Japanese people in this period specifically relied on the ocean because it's a new design of ship, conveniently for me. And this is a solution to travel when you need to carry a lot of bulky goods, especially large bales of rice, which they paid taxes with. Japan's a very mountainous country, but it has a very long shoreline, so it's much easier instead of trying to get this kind of goods from all the different domains into the shogunate, they sent them along the shore in these ships. So within these geographic constraints, the during this period, it was a new peacetime era. The new governments need to collect large amounts of tax rice from all of the domains all over the archipelago. This pushed domestic trade from its earlier center in the more sheltered Seto Inland Sea, that's pointed out in blue on the map here, to the entire Japanese archipelago. And this created a heyday of coastal trade where they brought over 7,000 ships a year into port in Edo alone. And to meet this demand, many new ships had to be built, and that drove the evolution of this new form of ship that's really suited to this trade. Along these lines here, you can see these are the shipping routes that they put together in the late 17th century to make sure that all the taxes, as much as possible, ended up safely delivered. So Western and Meiji Japanese, so the later period right after the Tokugawa, observers have compared Besaicen to these kinds of necessary features of ocean-going ships that were instrumental to global imperial power in the Age of Sail. And that makes the Besaicen, which is down in the lower right on this slide, look kind of bad. Even as far back as the 1690s, we have European observers like a man named Engelbert Kempfer, who traveled to Japan on a Dutch trading ship. He was German. Uh, and he has records, lots of records that he wrote and published in Europe about Japan at this time, and said that the Japanese wooden ships that he saw had a really weak structure. They seem to have been constructed deliberately to prevent them from being able to sail offshore. This is because Japanese people were barred by the shogunate from traveling overseas. So he interpreted that to mean, well, they must have made really terrible ships to force them not to be able to travel overseas, which I think doesn't actually make sense, right? And so by the late 19th century, which is when you get the shift into the Meiji period, a lot of modernization, industrialization, steamships come in, and both Japanese people and Westerners become really unimpressed with these Besaicen. They think that they were backwards and weak and terrible, and they describe them as things like clumsy-looking junks of the Japanese, which conflated the really different rig of Chinese junks, which you can see in the upper left here, with the Besaicen. So they're not even really looking at the details of the ships. They're just saying, oh, these are old, backwards kinds of ships. We don't like them. And I, looking at this, think that these kinds of observations were far more about observers' expectations than they were about the actual ships. And I wanted to get into what were they really like. It doesn't make sense to spend nearly a year constructing each one of these and a lot of money and timber and other supplies and make it fall apart really easily and make it a terrible ship for its purpose, right? So there's something else going on there. And so I've looked into this and found that the choices that people made in their ship construction always reflect assumptions about what kinds of conditions and risks the ship might encounter. And they're influenced by prior knowledge, but they're continually adapted to a specific environment. And they reflect the resources available to the builders and the sailors, the kinds of cargo they're expected to carry, and the priorities directing what they're going to do. And ship design did change in the Tokugawa period. And there's some weak points of these ships. They're not perfect because most of my information comes from shipwreck records, so we know they're not perfect. But the weak points remained all the way through this 250-year period. So you would think if they were really that bad, somebody would have fixed them, right? And instead, the uncorrected weak points, I think, are signs to us that those points were providing other advantages. They're not solely a problem. And so the coastal waters that they intended to use these ships in had particular features that they were adapted to, that those adaptations were then bad in open offshore waters, but they were hoping never to be there. So that wasn't really a problem. The shogunal government banned overseas voyages by Japanese people in 1634. So people knew when they were building these ships that they were only supposed to be near shore sailing. And there's other kinds of things going on, like less lumber available because they're doing a massive building campaign to build up the new city of Edo and castle towns and other things. And so there's different kinds of things that we can see in these adaptations, in the points of failure that we see. Why do they fail? Where do they fail? And how did that match up with what they might expect to encounter? And then there's also modern reconstructions that people have done of these ships to try to figure out more information about them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can and can't learn from those. So in looking at these ships, I think they really speak to the relationships that early modern Japanese people had with both the marine and terrestrial environments and resources. And that is something that I'm continuing to look into to see what other things it can tell us. So going back to these sea routes, starting with a shorter sea route for tax rice and sake delivery between the merchant city of Osaka and the shogunal capital of Edo, new official shipping routes hugged the Japanese coast on both the Pacific and the Japan Sea sides of the country from 1671 onwards. And these were specifically routes that you can see the dots here. I didn't translate the Japanese, but those are all names of ports. And that's showing this is how far you can expect to get, good places to stop, things like that. That was specifically for the tax ships originally. But just like the shogunal project to create major roads so that they could move armies as needed, the roads and shipping routes were then used by a lot of merchants because people already knew that was safe and convenient. And so the ships weren't just sending taxes along these routes. There were all sorts of ships sending all sorts of things up and down the coast once people figured out what the best pathways were. And they couldn't use these routes without taking into account the environmental conditions that they might run into. So what does this local environment look like? I'm not sure this map is all that easy to understand, but give it a shot. So what we have in Japan is a pattern of a winter monsoon season, which has regular several day long storm periods. So strong Siberian winds come from the northwest or the west. They've picked up a lot of energy crossing Siberia and they slam into Japan. And that's this green colors, the wind directions smashing into Japan in the sort of upper right corner of the slide. And because the Japan Sea coast is hitting that without any shelter at all, that's a particularly bad place to go sailing in the winter. The mountains of Japan block some of that from making it as much of a problem on the other side. But there's then a summer monsoon, which shifts those winds back the other direction from mid-July through August. And that brings a lot of heavy rain. occasionally a typhoon, but otherwise offers steadier and weaker winds from the southeast. So that's a better time to go sailing along the coasts. And people, therefore, generally did not want to be on the water when one of these really big, not even a storm really, but just like a storm front came through, and the great west wind, or just sometimes west wind shows up in the accounts of shipwrecks. It's like, oh, okay, there's your problem. We know this is going to be one of these big fronts coming through, and they didn't make it to port in time. And they're somewhat predictable in that they are approximately weekly, but they did not have the kind of meteorological predictions that we have now. And so sometimes people took their chances and didn't make it, right? Um, the typhoons that everybody knows about as still a problem today, if you're thinking about bad weather and storms, surprisingly, as the more I looked into it, are not actually the greatest problem for these ships. They do sometimes hit, as you can see from this image showing a typhoon that hit Nagasaki in 1874. But sailors generally waited out the winter in port, and they stayed in harbors between the stormy periods in the rest of the year. And so if a typhoon was coming, the wind and weather before the actual typhoon hit would be bad enough. They mostly were in port. They're not usually sailing when these really big storms hit. Instead, they're getting hit by lesser storms that are still not great. And so this is something which actually surprised me when I first looked into it, but really strong familiarity with what they could see, what they could predict, which wasn't as much as we can, helped to make sure they were sailing safely when they could. Um, Now, despite practical reasons for hopping from harbor to harbor and kind of waiting for it to look clear enough to get to the next one in time, over the course of the period, ships began sailing further out and making fewer port stops, sometimes sailing through the night for 2 days at a time, 3 days at a time. And so they did endure some bad weather more often rather than only waiting for a really good day and going just far enough that the weather was still good. And you can see this where in the 17th century, the trip from Osaka to Edo took an average of 1 month. And that includes a lot of time waiting in port. It's not travel time entirely. By the 19th century, the average was less than half that, and many ships actually made the trip in 4 days. They just pushed right through, didn't stop, and it wasn't actually that far to sail. And most of that difference came from a decreased willingness to wait for better weather. They also had, over the course of the period, the design of the ship was the same, but they got bigger. And so they sometimes couldn't fit into some of the earlier shelter ports. They were too large to stop over, and so they had to keep going. And part of that getting bigger was because you would have only a few more crew needed for twice as large a ship that could carry twice as much stuff. So it was much more expensive to send two smaller ships for the merchants than it was to pack more stuff onto a larger ship and hope for the best. And what you can see in this picture here, I've circled the little sails in the distance. There's a steady stream of ships coming in to anchor offshore. This is outside of Edo, and then smaller ships would come and unload those because these were too big to actually get all the way into wharves inside the city. So most Japanese harbors are very silt heavy. The rivers send a lot of silt down into them. They get shallow really quickly, even if they're dredged. Major ports like Osaka and Edo included, and these were the destinations for the largest cargo ships. Osaka was a merchant center, and Edo was the shogunal capital that all the goods are eventually getting sent to. And so those both had designated anchorages outside the main harbor. And the routes to the warehouses were with smaller rowboats taking stuff off of these ships. So the Beiseisen that you can see anchored here, you can see one of them has pulled up its rudder on the back. And so it's making the ship less deep because the rudders went down below the bottom of the hull. And so they could get into shallower areas by using this adaptation. They couldn't get entirely all the way into Ito, but they got closer. And in other smaller harbors, they had these relatively flat bottom ships with a liftable rudder designed for those kind of shallow areas. But at the same time, the continental shelf is really short next to Japan, so they could very easily get into really deep water. So it's either very shallow or very deep and not a lot in between. And so you have this liftable rudder is one important feature of these ships. And you can see here's another example of them at harbor. And in the back, you could actually see one of these smaller boats that rowed out to unload kind of in the lower left. And then right behind that is the rudder that's flipped up, and a little diagram where you can see they had to lift up this really, really big, heavy rudder. And that meant there's a hole in the back of the ship. There's a slot that the rudder has to come up through. And so waves can come in the back and make the inside of the ship wet. That is a weakness, that is a problem. But also, you can't get into the harbors sometimes without this kind of adaptation, right? And so this is a choice that they make, deciding that it's more worth having the flexibility to go into shallow water than to worry about having a totally watertight hull. And it's not like it leaks all the time, but if you're in a really bad storm, this is a place where you could potentially have a problem. Um, Also, we do have a few accounts of people, sometimes the ship would be turned so that the stern was to the beach and people could just walk off the back through that space where the rudder gets lifted. So it was sometimes a gangway, not always. And so this was something which was a choice that they had made in figuring out what they wanted these ships to look like. Some other features that people said maybe were a problem, and here you can see in this photo, the rudder isn't there, but where that person is standing on a ladder is where it would be, and you can see that it's open in the back. So this is not because it hasn't been finished that that's what it would look like. And so the shipwrights who were designing these also needed to, you can see the really flat sections of the ship. It's not a curved hull. They had built curved hulls before in Japan. They knew how that worked. But this design was much easier if you have scraps of lumber. You don't need really special curved pieces to make ribs and other kinds of things that are a kind of problem with the designs of European ships. Instead, you can just join together a lot of smaller pieces of flat wood and make these chines, make these flat sides that pull together really easily in comparison. You can deal with lumber shortages that way. And you also have a mast, which is really interesting. One of the problems of most naval-focused or maritime-focused powers in the Age of Sail was finding good, tall, straight trees that you could use as a mast. What they did in Japan was they just bundled together a whole bunch of sticks. I mean, very large sticks, so they're more, I should probably say poles. But the mast in this picture is actually not one single tree. It's a bunch of smaller pieces that are bound together with iron bands, which is very similar to the way that they made pine torches in Japan. They bundled together a bunch of reeds, and they knew this was relatively strong, and so they transferred that into making a mast, which is similar to the planks. It's a bunch of small pieces stuck together. And so these kinds of adaptations show partially that they have resource scarcity issues where they're trying to deal with having not the perfect single piece of lumber or really tall, straight trees. But they also are really useful and plenty strong enough for usually what they're doing. And this single mast and single sail is a design they keep no matter how big the ship is for these cargo ships. And that means that you have fewer crew needed than on the tall ships that you see in Europe and the US, where you've got multiple sails on each mast in different pieces. And you see there's no crow's nest here. That people don't have to climb up to the top of the mast to do anything, right? Everybody can stand on deck and just move the lines and you're fine. And so it takes fewer people to move these ships around. Now, all of that said, saying, oh, these are great features, when they failed, they did fail pretty dramatically. So This is the quote from Engelbert Kempfer, that German observer, who said, "Vessels are not built, nor may they be built according to the laws of the country, such that they can withstand high waves and weather a storm." Um, that's just his misunderstanding of the laws of the country. But it shows that people have historically assumed that these weaknesses were undermining the effectiveness of the ships on purpose, when in reality, they were adaptations to sailing in a particular place, and you get too far offshore and they become problems. But there's always going to be problems with any kind of ship design. It's a balance that you have to make. And so this was not a deliberate decision to cripple the ships. This is just there's a pattern in the way the ships break. So, keeping in mind that people were judging these ships after the advent of steamships, it's a very different system. They're looking at these and saying, "Oh, look!" And here's a picture of one in the middle of a wreck. The mast has been cut down. The rudder is broken. And now it's just a hull floating around. They can't do anything about, and it's getting very wet with a wave there. But expensive and complex technologies, like these ships, are not usually deliberately made less effective without a good reason. And there's no explicit law that says you cannot make a ship that is seaworthy. That's not in the laws of the period. There is a law that says you're not allowed to travel internationally, essentially. But the interpretation of what are you allowed to do and not allowed to do has been added on to what we find about regulations. And so shipwreck records show us that these adaptations were, yes, definitely points of failure, but not bad enough that people stopped building ships like this for a couple hundred years. And the rudder and its housing usually were broken in storms. That was a relatively weak point. The mast was a lever arm that could flip the ship over if the waves get bad enough, especially if the rudder is lost and you turned sideways to the waves. So they often had to cut down the mast. Well, if you have no rudder and you have no mast to put a sail up, you can't steer the ship. So then you have a hull, right? And that's actually really sturdy, because some of these shipwreck records, this is where there were survivors who came back and talked about it. This is some of the long ones that I've got listed here. A ship or a hull that drifted for 131 days with survivors, 286 days, and the longest one that we know of, 484 days before the ship finally drifted relatively close to the coast of California and got picked up by the three remaining people who had survived were picked up by a British ship. And they eventually looped their way back around, got back to Japan, and told the story about how they had done this. And this is not a weak ship. If it doesn't fall apart for over a year, like a year and a half of drifting in the open ocean, that's well built. It's just not steerable. And so it's thinking about, like, they're not deliberately making these bad ships. They just happen to not be perfectly adapted for the open Pacific, where they weren't supposed to go anyway. So until recently, this kind of thinking about these features as adaptations wasn't really something that people talked about. And part of that is because a lot of the expertise about these ships and how did they sail them and what were they good for was lost in the transition to steam-driven ships, to steel hulls, to a totally different kind of transportation. And so we have to look at other ways to figure out what's going on. We have quotes like Kempfer's that talk about how terrible they are, but he's not even a sailor, right? He's a doctor who's coming on this ship to do other things. And so how much of an expert is he really? And how does he know what the laws are? Like, who was interpreting that for him? He didn't know Japanese, right? And so who's telling him these things? And so I've been looking at what can we do to figure out what was going on with these that's maybe less biased. And one of these examples is these images here are a thing called funaima. They are a image that is donated to a shrine as part of a prayer, either before the ship goes out as a prayer for safety in that season, or sometimes after people have survived a wreck. And you can see these ones where it shows the ship in really bad conditions. They survived and they said, "Oh, thank you." And they donated to the shrine as part of that thanks. And so the illustrations on these show the ships, in dire straits in some cases, or in some cases sailing correctly. And you can think about ways that that shows us something different than just assuming that they're bad ships somehow. The other thing that we can do is think about reconstructing the ships. So the man named Tomenoshin is a traditional boat builder. He grew up making wooden fishing boats. And then the demand for wooden fishing boats went down. Mostly people wanted fiberglass boats. He was making fiberglass boats. But I guess he was bored with that or something. I'm not sure exactly. But he decided that he wanted to try making one of these besaicen, that he was part of a hereditary line of shipbuilders. And he knew that his ancestors in the Tokugawa period had built these ships, and he had the same techniques passed down to him for these smaller fishing boats he'd made. And he thought, let's just see what happens. And so he ended up building four reconstructed besaicen with different support. One of them was built with the support of a bunch of scholars in Osaka who had tested out the engineering of it and used a bunch of sources to try to work with him to figure out what it looked like. And some of it was just him working on it by himself. But he built four of these between the late 90s and 2005. And the process of building them, the process of looking at them, and a few sea trials, although these were really expensive and they didn't want to break them. So they didn't do very much sailing around with them, but they tried them out a little bit to test out some theories about how they would operate and how well they would sail upwind and things like that. And that does give us a lot of information that we didn't have before, although they were operated not by sailors with a lifetime of experience using these, but modern sailors who have very different experiences. So we do have to take these a little bit cautiously. But some of what they did, and this ship here is one of them. It's in the center of a museum on Sado Island that I get to go see next month, so I'm very excited about that. This is not my photo. But they have mostly been kept on land because they were very expensive projects. And so it's not like you could go out and resale them every year and try to figure out how that changed over time or anything like that. So they also went and looked at the few illustrations that we have. This is one example. It's very rare. It's from a shipbuilding family, and it's kind of all their secret image knowledge that they were supposed to pass along within the family. And this one is an illustration of how the sail was rigged. And it's a very unusual kind of setup. And you can kind of see in the circle on the left, there's a whole bunch of little lines coming down off the bottom of the sail. You'll maybe notice that the sail is a bunch of strips of fabric that are sewn together. And off of each of those strips is a line. And that's an unusual way to deal with a sail. And it seems to be tied to, in some fashion, this great big line that was tied across the deck. Kind of like a traveler, maybe, if you're a sailor and you know what that is, but probably not exactly. And you'll notice in the reconstruction of the Naniwa Maru, that was the one that did some sailing trials before she was put inside a museum, there's no lines hanging down that you can see from the bottom, because the sailors who were people who had been on sort of Western style yacht rigs, right? They didn't really know how to deal with this kind of square sail, and there were no instructions except maybe a couple images like this. They didn't really know how to adjust it. So they decided that for safety, they would bundle together all those lines and turn them into a sheet that was coming off the corner so it would behave more like a sail that they understood, which they were then able to sail reasonably well with, but that's not actually what sailors did in the time period when these ships were in use. So what does this actually tell us about? Well, for one thing, they're apparently pretty easy to sail even if you don't know what you're doing. So I guess that's good. But there's a lot of things that these reconstructions skipped over. Like they had a Coast Guard ship that was taking these photos that was trying to make sure that they were all safe, and they didn't allow them to do some of the tests that they wanted because they didn't want anybody to get injured, but also they didn't want to break this really expensive ship before it went into the museum. And so it can give us some information. And they sailed relatively well on things like sailing upwind and trying to get places that were not solely downwind. So that's useful to know, but it's not the whole answer as to what it was like to deal with these ships. And so one of the things that I concluded in looking at this kind of construction and why we have ignored these as historically useful ships in the time period. Like Japanese texts about this period don't usually mention them. They don't really get into the fact that there are so many ships involved in the coastal waters in this period. They really focus on land-based things. And so by looking back into these, during a time before the invention of steamships, when sailors were at the mercy of their local environment, much more because it's not just the water, but also the wind that they have to deal with. They weren't just surviving, right? They were adapting to it. They were working with these conditions, the shallowness of the water, the strength of the currents, all these different kinds of things. And the ships they built were made for that. And if we think about how those ships were built and how the kind of signs we have of how they might have used them, then we know a lot more about the environmental conditions they're operating in and also the way people thought about the water. And so this dramatic expansion of the domestic trade in coastal waters, they end up with a whole bunch of new ships, relatively quickly built, new design, easier to build, easier to operate. And that's a kind of cultural environment that we have to think about as well. But when I look at all of these, I think that it shows that the maritime space in this period was hugely important, and we really need to think about that more. And the way that people knew that ocean was different than the modern view of the ocean. You can't just turn on an engine and go anywhere you want, right? That there's different ways that people felt about this space, that they thought about it, that they dealt with it religiously, all these different kinds of things. And so I want to end off with one, maybe two, we'll see how long it takes me, shipwreck accounts, just to give you a sense of what stories I have to work with that I started with this project with, because everybody likes hearing about disasters, right? So first one, in 1830, a ship named the Tenjin Maru was headed from Shimonoseki. It was carrying tax rice to Edo, and it wrecked in a storm just offshore of the Shima Peninsula, about halfway there. You can see on the map here. The government had some concerns about the report of the wreck that was provided because everybody who was carrying tax rice, the law was that you had to report if you'd lost any of it, right? If you wrecked or had other problems. And their report was dubious. So a shogunal official came from Osaka, the nearest place that they could get down to the Shima Peninsula from. And he came and he investigated this case further and discovered that the crew had actually stopped along the way and secretly sold some of the rice in key domain. As you can see, just before they got to the Shima Peninsula, they offloaded cargo, which was not theirs. This was taxes that belonged to the government, and they made money off of it. And they said, oh, we lost in a storm. Oh, too bad. And the government official said, no, that is not okay. So you stole from the government, right? And so they officials feared that this was actually a deliberate wreck rather than just hoping that nobody noticed they lost some rice. It's unclear whether it was deliberately wrecked or whether they just had the bad luck to end up in a storm where they said, oh, now's our chance to pretend like we lost the rice there. But the supercargo, who was a samurai who traveled only on the domainal tax rice ships just to supervise the cargo, so he should have stopped them from selling off this cargo. The captain and the crew were all punished for having done this. But it was even worse because the fishermen from the region around the Shima Peninsula had found this wreck and the drifting cargo that often in the process of wrecking, they would offload some of the cargo on the deck to make this hull more stable to hope that they could survive. And so often there's a bunch of drifting pieces that people would come once the storm got less bad, they would row out and pick up survivors and cargo. And so these fishermen went and they found this, but because it just so happened in 1830 there was a famine in this area, they decided that they were just going to take all the rice and divide it up and eat it and not mention that they'd found it. Now, we know that this was illegal, and they knew that this was illegal because there had been a proclamation issued by the shogunate. Actually, they did this a bunch of times, so clearly they had to keep reminding people about this, that people had to quickly report any signs of a shipwreck. And their excuse was that the proclamation happened to arrive in their village later after they'd already found this stuff and done away with it. So too bad. But they should have known better because this was a regular process. And so the local village headman, rather than when this new proclamation came in saying, oh no, we didn't realize, we did see one last week, decided to double down. And he commanded the villagers to destroy all evidence that they had salvaged anything from the wreck, like the rope and the straw bales that had covered the rice that they had taken. And he did not report the wreck. But, and the reason I know about this is because somebody in the village had a grudge against the village headman and reported him to the higher authorities. And so the shogunate sent an official to find out what was going on in this village. And the fishermen doubled down again on their crime by killing the shogunal official sent to investigate the case. So now they've just made it so much worse. And somebody still, I mean, the official didn't come back, so they sent somebody else to figure out what's going on. And so the village headman and 10 other people involved in the theft and cover up were executed for having done all of this, when they could have just reported and said, oh, we didn't realize. And the shogunate probably would have said, well, that rice was kind of salty from soaking up the water. It's fine, whatever. So this case is really interesting because it is more fraught than the usual shipwrecks. There's more crime and theft involved. But it shows the kind of risks that faced coastal shipping. Environmental dangers, yes, but also theft and fraud. And also how much the villagers who were along the coast were involved with shipping of cargo, even when they weren't working for the cargo ships. They were expected to go out and help salvage if there was a wreck. They were expected to save people who were floating around after a wreck. There wasn't really a Coast Guard at the time, but they served in something like that purpose. They would often shelter sailors who made it to shore and then send a bill to the government to say, we paid for their food, could you please pay us back? And so we know that at least along the coast, and you'll note there's a lot of coastline in Japan, people were integrated into this process of shipping, even if they weren't making money off of it, they weren't working on the ships, right? And so it's not a totally isolated, separate thing that's happening, right? And many wrecks, we don't know how many were completely lost at sea because, well, they're just missing, right? There's not necessarily a record. But we do know that many of the wrecks involve just partial damage to the ship, like those hulls that drifted for a really long time. So people survived them, or part of the ship survived them. And so we know from those that there's a relatively high chance of a non-fatal shipwreck, that they thought they could get away with having lost some rice by selling it instead of having lost some rice just along regular operating procedures that the government would have been okay with. Now, also, we know that the local fishermen relied on the assumption that some wrecks would just happen and nobody would know about it, right? And that makes it hard as a historian to know, like, I've had people ask, like, what's the proportion of ships that wrecked? And I have no idea, right? Was it 2%? Was it 5%? Was it 50%? Probably not 50%, but I don't know. So the wreck of the Isemaru is another one that I want to tell you about, which is maybe more typical. Whoops. No, go back. Sorry. There we go. And so this one is described in a shipwreck record that I have a whole set of these that have lasted into the modern era, and they've been reprinted in a 6-volume set of books that is very helpful because then I don't have to read the handwriting. And this one is a particularly detailed version, but I think it's more typical than the Tenjin Maru. And this one, it happened, so near the end of the first year of the Meiwa era, which is 1764, There was a relatively inexperienced 19-year-old sailor named Magotaro, sometimes known as Mago Shichi. So the names vary a little. He was crew on this cargo ship Isemaru, and we have details like they set sail at dawn on the 18th day of the 10th lunar month from the Pacific coast in northern Japan. And it was somewhere between Oshu and Joshu. I put the arrow where I think maybe it was, but not really clear. Over 40 ships had been sheltering from bad weather in the harbor that they left from with them. And the Isemaru's helmsman, a man named Shinshichi, had talked to some of the sailors on those other ships about what the wind might be doing. They're all kind of guessing, is it going to be good to leave? What should we do? Anybody know this area really well? What do you think? The answer had been relatively unclear. Nobody was really sure. And the wind seemed to get better overnight. So he decided to take a chance and head south in the morning. And they reached the waters off Cape Shioyami, which is pretty close to where that arrow is, kind of where the J is on Joshu. And the previously favorable wind shifted to the west. West winds are bad, remember. And the sun dimmed. The sea surface took on an unusual appearance. So we have all these details about what it's like to be out there, and this is a problem, right? And the crew discussed all of these signs, and they looked at all the ships around them. Remember, there's 40 other ships out there also heading in this direction. They were all turning around and going back to the harbor they left from. But one of the crew, essentially the one who was steering, refused to consider turning back. He's like, no, we're going to keep going. He was the one who had the most experience of the route that they were taking. And the rest of the crew were really kind of scared about all these signs of bad weather, but he just would not listen to them. And by sunset, the color of the sky was really bad. There's only one other ship in sight. Everybody else has left. And Magotaro, who doesn't really know what's going on, he's a new crewman. He looks back in his story of this wreck, and he said, "Yeah, actually, there were some earlier signs that we were on a bad omened ship, that we maybe had misfortune, and this was coming for us." So he, or maybe another sailor, there's many versions of this story, so it's unclear which one is the most correct one, had dreamt about a spirit coming from the shrine on the ship and warning him, or warning the dreamer, that they needed to turn back. This is a problem. And this had been on the night of the 14th, and they had left on the 18th, right? So in that week that they were waiting around to leave. But he was really unexperienced, and he's like, I don't know if I should tell anybody. They might laugh at me. They might not believe me. Maybe it was just a dream. But then thinking back in the middle of the storm, he's like, no, that wasn't just a dream. That was a warning. I should have listened to the warning, right? And also thinking back at this moment, he remembered they had lost a sailor overboard that summer. And they had, and it was not in a storm. It was just, he just randomly tripped and fell overboard, and they couldn't get him back. So that's a danger that I guess could happen to many sailors. And then the other thing he remembered was they had a crewman who had actually absconded with the money that was supposed to pay for the sailors' lodgings at one of the ports that they stayed in. And clearly that was a bad sign that, one of their crew had been a thief. And so these things are both things to think about as far as like what bad luck somebody might have, but they also tell us a lot about what it's like to operate these ships. Oh, they had sailors' inns that specifically the sailors stayed at and that they paid for sometimes. Sometimes they slept on the boat, right? And so it gives us clues as to a broader experience in normal kinds of sailing, not just these storms. So in any case, they had not heeded any of these signs, which maybe were clearer in hindsight than they were at the time that they showed up. And Magotaro was the only survivor of this ship, and he was interviewed later. And he was told, he told this story to somebody who wrote it down. He didn't write it down himself. But we have somewhat direct experience from him. And he said, and here's a quote from that record. As night deepened, from the southwest horizon, black clouds rose with rain like overturning a tray. Immense amounts of flashes of lightning, thunderclaps, and seething water. They were unsure which direction the port was in. From between the huge waves, there were three lights, dimly perceptible, and that might have been the signal to ships from shore, like come back here, or a lighthouse. It's something like that, right? And then he continued, now the ship had to turn back, and they were working all hands hard. The power of the wind was incessant and fierce, and the mast was bending like a bow. They had to lower the sail, but no matter how much power they put into it, the wind would quickly move it, and they could not manage to reef or lower it. And suddenly, the wind took the firewood off the deck and hit the sail with it, tearing it. And then the wind could leak out a little, and they finally got the sail down. So things just kept getting worse. He keeps talking about, and this whole progression he remembers years later. So it might not be exactly correct, but also it was probably pretty memorable. And it's very similar to a lot of other wrecks, right? That they have to take the sail down. The mast is still trying to flip the ship over as the rudder breaks. The waves are bashing the side of the rudder and snapping that. And things are getting thrown off the deck. The rain is pouring, or the wind, or the waves are pouring into the gaps in the deck, which is not waterproof. And they're really worried. They're pumping the ship out. And at a certain point, it's clear there's just nothing they can do. And either they're lucky, not like the Isemaru, and they still have their dinghy on board, and they abandon the ship and they row away from the ship. And sometimes they come back and get the cargo when things die down. Or this is why the man overboard was really unlucky for the Isemaru. They had lowered the tender, the dinghy, in the hopes that the man overboard would find it and climb aboard and save himself. But that meant they didn't have one later. And so now they're stuck on this ship. It's drifting away. They actually drift between some islands off the coast that they could have rowed out to, except they didn't have a boat to do it with. So we see some of the things that they look back and think that was a bad decision. But in other cases, the ship might have been saved, or at least the sailors, and not looked as bad as this particular one. So this is something which the story keeps going with other details, because this was one that was drifting for a really long time. But I think it gives you a sense of the flavor of some of the information that we can get somewhat directly from the sailors, not entirely, because he didn't write this himself, and so it's interpreted by the people he's talking to. But they do give us a kind of stereotypical process of wrecking, which shows that, yes, these weaknesses were a problem in the ships. They caused particular kinds of wrecks. But also, we only have 100 or so of these castaway accounts, which are from people who were wrecked and came back to Japan. And they had to give an official accounting of how they've broken the law and gone overseas. And so we don't know what the proportion of those is compared to ones that never came back, as compared to ones that never went overseas but didn't survive, right? And as compared to things more like the Tenji Maru, where they were always within sight of land, and they didn't have to give an account, except if they were a tax carrying ship where they had to say how they had lost the rice. So they give us a snapshot, but maybe not the entire story. And I'm still trying to, piece together what larger stories we can understand from this. But I hope that this little pieces and snapshots can give you a sense that this is something which has a lot of really useful information for us about part of this history of Japan that has not been looked into enough, in my opinion, and that can give us a really new view of the people and the lives of not just sailors, but people along the coast. How did the society operate within, including not just the people walking along this road here, but also out into the waters surrounding the archipelago. So I will stop there, but I'm happy to answer questions, talk more about any of these. I will, I think, move my slides away so I can see some people. There we go.
Bina, thank you so much. I deeply appreciate also the artwork that you were able to find to give us these images. So we had more than just your great descriptions, but love the artwork from this time period.
Yeah.
I would love people to turn on cameras if they have a question to ask or some comment to make. We have been at for a little bit longer.
Yes, and I have some questions in the chat here, so I will just start with those while everybody else is thinking about your questions.
Perfect.
Um, so there was a question about pirates who like was that a danger? Were they attacking these ships? And actually, in this period, no. There had been piracy in the Warring States period. That was one of the big problems right before this period in all of East Asia. But the states around that sort of area of piracy from the South China Sea all the way up to Japan had managed to suppress the piracy, had managed to get rid of the main problems, so that there really doesn't seem to have been any in this period. There were smugglers, there were people who maybe were like the Tenjin Maru doing things that were somewhat illegal, but we don't seem to have had any concern about being attacked as part of this process, and that includes the useful fact to note about this period, there really wasn't a navy at this point. The shogunate had some ships that they had fought with kind of at the start of the period, but their solution to making sure that they were not defeated by one of the domainal lords that they had managed to kind of unify the country by suppressing the powers against them was to get rid of the navies. So there was a law that banned ships larger than 500 koku, which is a koku is a one bale of rice. So it's a volume measurement I forget what that works out into tons, but it's, you know, not as big as these ships got. And it turns out that that wasn't really about the merchant ships. That was about controlling large naval ships, and that worked. So attacks were less of a problem than environmental problems were. Um, So another question we have here is when was there a prohibition on going abroad? So that started in 1634 and it went mostly into the 19th century as more and more foreign ships started showing up in Japan in the 19th century, in and around Japan, and trying to open up treaty ports and trying to open up trade. They didn't officially get rid of the prohibition, but it became less of a prohibition just because there wasn't as much that they could do about it. And it ended in 1868 with the end of the Tokugawa. This was not true of Korea and China. So Chinese ships were still coming to trade with Japan. That was their largest trade partner at the time. But they were controlled to only come into Nagasaki. And they also had ships that were coming in. There was like one Dutch ship a year that was trading European goods, but mostly the Ming and the Qing, which were the two Chinese dynasties that kind of overlap with this period. They were both not really that concerned with things offshore. The Ming had been the ones who suppressed piracy, and they just didn't want to deal with offshore stuff. They were much more focused inland with those borders. And so there wasn't a prohibition on going anywhere, but they also weren't supporting a lot of ocean-based trade. And Korea was not as worried about that. They were more worried about being attacked because the Japanese forces, Hideyoshi had invaded Korea in the late 1500s, but they were not worried about controlling the movement of their people. Um, so Japan was a bit unique in this, and because they're islands, they thought, well, we can just not worry about being attacked if we don't send people out there to, I guess, make other people angry or cause problems. um, Let me see if I got any other questions. So yes, Oda Nobunaga did use some naval warfare when he was unifying the country, and the Tokugawa also used some, but by the early 1600s, they had pretty much defanged all of the naval forces that existed so that they didn't have to worry about somebody overturning their newly unified peace. Um, Oh, so a bale of rice. I don't actually have a picture. So the bales of rice, they weren't bags. They were what they would do is they're kind of the size of a barrel, like a wine barrel size-ish. And you would take the rice and you would wrap it up with rice straw. And so that would make a nice package. that would hold the grains of rice inside the stems of rice. And so they kind of weave together a mat that would wrap around it that would make this bale that was called a koku. Um, any other questions?
Michael, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Or can you?
Oh, we briefly heard you, but then you went mute again.
No, I'm just, maybe I'm not doing that. How
There
about
you
now?
go.
Okay, now I just had a couple observations with the shallow hull boat. It almost reminded me of the oyster boats that they have back in some of the shallower bays in Massachusetts. They go out and their virtue is shallow water for one, and they can really race pretty quickly. So it seemed like that was a virtue. The only problem is without the deep keel like the Phoenicians had on their boats, they're sort of stuck like the Nile, the Egyptians' boats. They were stuck to rivers, and they couldn't really tack and go back and forth. And just having those one mainsail, you can only be blown in one direction or another, and
Yeah.
so to have 40 boats coming down, each delivering at a different time, then they're stuck down there, or maybe waiting for the next season to blow them back up. I don't know, but it just seemed like an inefficient way to get about a coastline with a maritime country or nation. They've been around for a long time and had a real opportunity to figure out sailing better than they had.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the reasons why they did sea trials with the reconstructed ships. They're like, well, how well could they tack upwind? And it turns out that they could actually tack upwind. They were not only sailing downwind, because that wouldn't, you're right, that makes no sense, right? They did, so they don't have a centerboard, which is one way to prevent drifting with a shallow ship, but the rudder is really a lot deeper, and so it's not a centerboard, but it's kind of helping make a bit of a keel on the back. Some of these were like 98 square feet, like they're really big.
Oh yeah,
And so there's a surface that helps with leeway. So they could, I forget the exact degree that they could head into the wind, but they could tack really easily upwind compared to what you would expect from a single square sail. It's actually it's a rectangular sail, but I guess the adjustments that they made did work to get them able to go against the wind better than you might expect from just looking at them.
Oh, that's great. And then the other question I had was like, who financed the building of the boats? Obviously, if they were tax rice, it was for the folks who were collecting the rice, the equivalent of money, and they would have more of an incentive to build them, I guess, than the sailors themselves or the townspeople who would be buying the rice. But who was it that financed that and got the profits from the sale?
So some of these were built by the domain lords. So the domainal funds were used to construct the ship so that they could send their taxes to the shogunate. And so that was one option. But in some cases, especially for the smaller domains that didn't have as much money to work with, they instead would just hire a ship to take the tax rice. So there were merchants who financed the building of ships, but usually the merchants, it would not be one merchant who built the ship himself. It would be a sort of cooperative set of merchants. So you would invest in part of a ship. And so you would have merchants who owned pieces of multiple ships so that if they lost one of them, they didn't lose everything. So there was a system involved where you could pay the shipbuilder from multiple different sources and kind of co-own the ship. Sometimes the captains of the ships owned a ship. They got rich enough in their work that they managed to invest in owning the ship that they were captaining. But sometimes they were hired captains. So they didn't own the ship. They were just working for the owner who was back on shore. So there's actually a bunch of different ways that they finance these.
Oh, that's great. So we took a concrete cooperation of governments along the regions then to pull that off. And rather than having insurance companies or things like the Dutch would do to finance.
Right. This was sort of a form of insurance in that they're spreading the risk out, but it wasn't an insurance company.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that talk.
You're welcome.
David next, and then Lydia. Thanks for your hands up.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Professor Arts, is wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And I guess building on that, you may have said it earlier in the talk, but I might have missed it. And that is, did any of these ports, certainly Edo, wind up becoming critical shipbuilding ports? Or did it wind up that this type of craft was being built all over the country? And then the other thought I had, particularly given sort of the negative judgments about these Japanese ships, particularly from the German doctor who visited.
Yeah.
Is that like another piece of the kind of racism we see from Westerners on things that are just different and not imbuing any intelligence in why somebody would do it this way?
Yeah, I'll answer that second one first. Definitely, there was a racist and condescending perspective involved where the Europeans were like, we're the best, we know everything, and therefore these people couldn't possibly be doing better than we are at building ships or doing other things. And the ships in the 1600s, none of them were that great. Right? I mean, the ship that he sailed on was leaky and horrible, and so the way that they talk about, oh, these are terrible, it's like you got to remember that none of them were really particularly comfortable. And so I'm not sure that there's really any kind of positive, like this is better behind that understanding. It's more just racism saying, well, these people are uncivilized and therefore their ships are clearly worse. And that also layers into in the Meiji period, it wasn't just like Americans, British, French, who were saying, oh, these old ships are bad. You need steamships. You need the new style of ships. Japanese people also absorbed that priority, right? They were trying to prove that they were just as strong a country and that they shouldn't be a colony. They should be an empire all on their own. And they absorbed some of that, not the racism and saying, oh, we are terrible at this, but instead saying the Tokugawa period, our past selves, our past culture is bad and not civilized and didn't know what they were doing. So these ships are bad. And our new culture has learned better, and we have surpassed what we learned from other people, and we've made it our own, and this is better. So there's a layer of thinking about wanting to get rid of the old stuff, even if it wasn't necessarily worse. They just assumed it was because steamships operate a very different way, right? And so people who are used to sailing on steamships are prioritizing very different things. You don't have to worry about the wind. You make straight lines, all these different kinds of things. So there's definitely some condescension from different angles that's going on into these judgments that I'm trying to peel back and say, well, but what just by themselves, what were they good at? What were they like? Let's see what's going on there. And then as far as the shipbuilding ports, yes, Osaka was the center of shipbuilding. There were huge numbers of shipbuilders there. That was the main place that a lot of these ships were built. And that was it was essentially the merchant capital of Japan, right? That's where most of the merchant houses had a base. That's where a lot of the money came in. A lot of the tax rice actually went to Osaka and was converted into other stuff. And that stuff got sent to Edo because yes, the rice was technically the thing that was the tax, but the samurai who were getting their stipends from the government in rice wanted more than just rice. And so, sometimes they had essentially a line of credit, right? So the rice would come into Osaka and the merchants would convert that. And then they would send that piece of paper that says, you can draw on this amount of rice and you can draw it out of the bank in Osaka, in Edo and buy a new sword or whatever. So the shipbuilding was mostly in Osaka, but there were plenty of places around the country that built some ships, especially as you get further away, like up in the north where there's a lot of lumber. Sometimes they would build a ship and load it with lumber and then send it down, various things like that. So I think a lot of the most busy ports would want to have nearby shipbuilding, but I'm not yet sure. My research trip next month, I'm hoping to look into some of that and see like how much shipbuilding was there in different places.
So cool. Thank you very much.
Lydia, go on.
Great. Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting talk. I had a couple of questions. One is a small terminology question. So in Hyogo Prefecture and in most of the museums here, I've seen the word kitamae bune used.
Yes.
A bit, but I haven't seen bezaisen so much.
Yeah.
Is
so
one like a
Yeah, bezaisen is the umbrella term for all of the different cargo ship types, and the kitamaibune is a type. So that is a subset of the bezaisen. The bezaisen are also known as sengokubune, which is 1,000 koku ship, even though they didn't always have that size. Some of them were 2,000 koku, some of them were 500. So I like to use bezaisen because it's less confusing about like what type of ship are you covering? The Kitamaibune are the ones specifically built for the trade with the Ainu to get kelp and furs and salmon. And so they were coming along the Japan seaside and going down to trade through Nagasaki. So that's one type. But there also were ones that were called like Higakibune, which are they're named after just a kind of woven sides on the gunnels that's visually distinctive. And those were ships that ran between Osaka and Edo. And then there's another set that specifically did that run with sake barrels. And so they're called tarubune, which is just barrel ship because they were just loaded with sake. So there's these different types that are kind of underneath that. Yes.
Okay, that kind of relates to my second question too, was how consistent is the design of the ships with the place that they were constructed? Because
Mhm.
I can see how like with the type over Honshu, you expect it to be pretty consistent within there. But then moving out towards the northern part of Hokkaido, down south to the Amami Oshima, like the places that were nominally under Edo control, but maybe not as tight as Honshu. Are they
Mhm.
still using the same kinds of ships? Is there more variation?
Yeah, so overall, the sort of broad features are very similar, and that's in part because while there were specific ones, like the ones I just mentioned, where they're named after their very specific routes, a lot of these ships actually did a bunch of different routes. So, like the Ainu didn't have their own trade ships. It was Japanese people coming in with trade ships, which might then go do a different route. And so they were less place-based than they might be. I've seen some where the domainal ship goes down from I'm trying to remember where this one started. It was somewhere on the Japan seaside, and it went down through Shimonoseki, and it went up through the inland sea. It stopped in Osaka. It dropped off all its tax rice. It picked up a bunch of merchant goods so that it wasn't empty on the way back. It went back to the domain, and then it picked up a different contract and said, "Oh, instead of taking tax rice again, we're going to go up to Matsumai, and we're going to get some kelp." And then that went really well, and they decided they were going to go down the Pacific coast side and pick up some lumber. And so they often were doing a bunch of different routes, and so it wasn't really specifically like specialized ships in particular areas. They tended to move around more.
Actually, little follow-up question.
Sure.
So, but does that imply that the captains had a lot of freedom over to like whether they were choosing which jobs to take? Was it mostly like a captain in charge of their own ship was running the business? Or
Yeah,
was there a
that
lord
varied a
that would own
lot.
the ship?
So sometimes, like if they're taking a ship that's owned by the domain, they have less flexibility because like they have to go where the domain wants them to go, right? But those ones, the captain and some of the crew were often allowed to carry a little bit of cargo of their own to sell. So as an incentive to take the tax rice, they also got a little bit of profit on whatever they wanted to speculate in trading. And in some cases, they could if the domain had a particular like thing that they needed them to bring back, then okay, well, we have to do that. But sometimes it was, well, you don't want to come back empty. So why don't we try getting some stuff for the domain? It only takes up half the ship, and then we'll do some other stuff and we'll speculate. And if it comes out well, domain lord's happy with it. Um, in other cases, if it was a hired captain, who didn't own part of the ship and also wasn't on contract with the domain or a loyal retainer of the domain, then they would have less flexibility because they're doing what the owner wants, right? They could potentially argue like this is a good idea, this is going to make you money, but I think that's why some of the successful captains wanted to buy into owning the ships because then they could make more decisions about where the ship is going to go and where they go next, how fast they go, these sorts of things. So.
Professor Arts, that actually raises another question. When you look back at that era, it seems like just in this one domain, there's a fair amount of entrepreneurship.
Mhm.
And so within the shogunate, then I suspect, land-based things probably also had a lot of merchants and the like. And again, as long as they played fair and paid their taxes and the like, I assume there was a fair amount of commercial activity.
Mhm. Yeah, and this is part of what got me interested when I was thinking about studying boats of some kind as a like there's a uh, kind of awkward sounding term, envirotechnical interface, that ships are combining the technical construction and adaptation with environmental conditions, right? And I could have looked at fishing boats, right? I could have looked at any type of boat, and I didn't want to look at all types of boats because that's too many. And one of the things that got me interested in these cargo ships is that this time period is well known for being a rapid increase in mercantile cash-based economy, right? There's people who talk about it as proto-capitalistic or various proto-industrial. It kind of depends on how much you want to assume that this was heading towards capitalism, but it definitely was a thriving mercantile economy that really picked up when the Tokugawa peace started, because it's hard to be really successful merchant when the armies keep marching through and destroying stuff in their way, right? So the Tokugawa peace had really just set up conditions well for there being this much more entrepreneurial kind of economy. And so the cargo ships are one reflection of that, but certainly there's land-based merchants too. And a lot of merchants would kind of invest partway in, say, indigo being shipped on this one ship, but also in something that's being traded over land, right? But also I mean, a lot of merchants are sake merchants. So like they take rice and they turn it into alcohol and they earn a bunch of money off of that because lots of people like to buy alcohol. And then they take that money and they invest it in lots of other kinds of things. Right. And so we have sake merchants who own part of a merchant ship that they're not sailing themselves, but they're sending people not with their sake, but with other stuff that they're also trading. So certainly it's part of a larger picture as far as the economics of the period. And it's really interesting because when I got into history, I thought, well, economics is the thing I'm least interested in, and somehow that's not actually what I ended up like. As I study it, it's like, no, actually, this matters in so many different ways. And so I'm not an economic historian, but I do actually end up looking at a lot of this kind of stuff in looking at the environment and resources and trade and these things. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
John, go ahead.
Sure. This is perhaps kind of a sideways question from all of the economics and business activity, but
All right.
one of the things that has interested me about seafaring and seafaring history and the other parts of the world is the sailors' culture and the music that comes out of that. That what was there that kind of a culture among the Japanese seafaring class, and do we know what a Japanese sea shanty would sound like?
I wish I knew. So definitely there were songs that were specifically relevant to sailors. At least we know of ones that would have been songs in like festivals or like as part of when they go to a shrine before their trip for the year, they might have songs that are partially prayers. But I don't know that we have much, if any, information about more working songs like sea shanties. There is a little bit of just like hints that maybe there's something in some of the Castaway records, like the Magotaro one is detailed enough that it does include some chanting, which may well mean singing. The words are the same, so it's not really clear what exactly that would sound like, but there were some kind of work some things, but I don't know if they were as formalized as shanties. Like, I don't know if there were like specific verses or if it was just sounds. And there's not a lot of information about musical instruments that they might or might not have had aboard as part of this. So that is something that I'm keeping an eye out for, because sailors' culture is one of the things that I'm interested in. Like, how different were these people from the more mainstream culture of this time period? But so far, don't have a solid answer for you.
Well, always useful to know what we don't know as well as what we
Yes.
do. Thank you.
Lots that we don't know. But there's definitely there are work songs for and I think this came up in the comments here, Sorambushi. There are work songs for rowing, and there are work songs for the kind of everyday fishing labor. I just don't know how much those transfer to the cargo ships. And whether there's, hauling on the sail type songs. I don't know why there wouldn't be. I just don't know where the evidence might be for them. So.
Another topic for another time.
Yeah.
Dr. Arch, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation, and good luck as you head to Tokyo. Do you think you get to actually go on a boat?
Well, I'm going on a ferry, so not the
Okay.
same kind of boat as these, but part of my trip is to Sado Island, which you can only get to by ferry. So
Excellent. All right. Well, we'll have to reschedule a follow-up when you are back and ready to present your findings.
all right.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much.
Thanks so much.
Dr. Arch.
Have a good
Wonderful.
evening, everybody.